You're on mute.
Got it. Yeah, sorry, just caught my, hi everybody. I was on mute. No, I'm not muted. And I want to say good day, one and all, and welcome to our Zoomcast here, Spirit and the Machine, Catholic Responses to an Increasingly Artificial World. My name is Michael Murphy. I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. And I suppose here is a relative term as I'm coming to you live, not from Loyola, but from one of our many digital outposts here at Loyola in my home just outside of Chicago. And thanks to the wonders of digital technology, I'm able to do so. So I think more on that and that kind of thing in short order. One thing I want to mention, I think my luck has run out as far as quiet setting goes. I've been Zooming for a year and a half from my home, and it's been smooth sailing, all things considered. But today it's noise central outside my doors. And they say there are two seasons in Chicago, winter and construction. And construction, I think, has arrived to the Windy City. So many apologies if any noise comes through, and I'll try to navigate that. But let us soldier on. And on behalf of our Hank Center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey, our graduate assistant, Kathleen McNutt, and on behalf of our generous co-sponsors, America Media and Nick Sawicki, the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, and Don Hyder, and the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, and David Gibson. We are so pleased you joined us for what promises to be an excellent conversation and an hour well spent. You know, artificial intelligence, AI, is bringing about profound changes in the lives of human beings, and it will continue to do so. AI offers enormous potential, especially in medicine, science, engineering, ecological sustainability, so much more. AI and the automation of work, which is kind of associated with it, can improve social coexistence and personal well-being by augmenting human capabilities and enabling or facilitating many tasks that can be carried out more efficiently and, in some cases, more effectively. However, as Pope Francis observes, and so many others, but Pope Francis in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, the exaltation of technological thinking as a main lens of reference and value for humankind comes with a host of possible problems. The transformations currently underway affect the way we perceive reality and human nature itself, so much so that they can influence our spiritual lives, our mental and interpersonal habits and relationships, our politics and power structures. Recently, Pope Francis observed yet again on the topic of AI, and he observed this: now more than ever, we must guarantee an outlook in which AI is developed with a focus not on technology, but rather for the good of humanity and of the environment, of our common and shared home, of its human inhabitants who are inextricably connected to one another. So I look forward to our excellent panel conversation on these topics, the promise and the perils of life in an increasingly artificial world. And just a word about format before I introduce our guests and hand it over to John Farrell. Today's Zoomcast is classified as a meeting. This means that while the chat is limited, we use the chat for interaction, but please direct your interaction to me, because that's where your questions and comments should go. I will look at your question and comments and make kind of an order as our speakers speak. So if anything occurs to you, just write it, an observation, a question, and I will get to as many as I can. That's always my promise. We will reserve the last 10, 12 minutes for this kind of thing. We just have an hour, so we'll be kind of on the move. So that's it. If you think it, write it down, and I thank you in advance. So with that, let's welcome our speakers. Our first is John Farrell. And John is a writer and producer working in Boston. He is the author of The Day Without Yesterday, Lemaitre, Einstein, and the Birth of Modern Cosmology, and that was from Basic Books. He also wrote The Clock and the Camshaft and Other Medieval Inventions We Still Can't Live Without. And that just came out from Prometheus. John also wrote an excellent article which appears in the April edition of Commonweal on the future of artificial intelligence. And that's a really solid article there. We were all thinking in our prep meeting that that could be evolved into a book, really, John. So add that to your to-do list. Also want to welcome Father Phillip Larrey, who is a Catholic priest and holds the chair of logic and epistemology at the Pontifical Lateran University in the Vatican. He's also the dean of the philosophy department there. Father Larae has published several books concerning the effects of the new digital era on society, and his most recent, Artificial Humanity, is an evolved discussion of what AI research means for all of humanity, both philosophically and as a challenge to industry and public policy, which indicates our third speaker's lane, as it were, in many ways, and that's Anne Skeet, who joined the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University as its Senior Director of Leadership Ethics in 2014. Anne researches, writes, and speaks about the ethical dilemmas of leaders and followers, corporate culture, and the ethical challenges of governance, and she works with executives to shape and reinforce organizational cultures that encourage ethical outcomes. So this is a great panel, as you can see, and our panel has agreed to kind of proceed alphabetically. So it falls to you, John Farrell, to get us started. And John, thanks for being here. Panel, thank you for being here. But John, welcome to our Zoom stage, and the stage is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be invited to participate in the discussion. As a writer, I come from a background, I should say my focus of interest is history and science, and within that, in particular, religion and science as a part of that, and even more particular, the Catholic Church's role in the rise of science going back to the Middle Ages. What ideas are alive to me on the topic of AI, which is, at the very front end now? I'd have to say the potential for true artificial intelligence, I think, is the most fascinating. And by that, I mean, I'm following the work of Judea Pearl at UCLA, who is interested in machines that can think causally. Right now, the hype is all around deep learning and machine learning, and we're all going to discuss that. But I think the potential for true artificial intelligence raises a host of really interesting and perhaps disquieting questions. The second thing that fascinates me is how the hype is obscuring the current dangers and challenges posed by artificial intelligence. We've seen it recently in the past couple of elections in the US, where AI algorithms in social media have contributed to a great deal of strife and bitterness and alienation amongst Americans. And part of that too connects to the other disquieting aspect of AI as it's currently understood, and the hype tends to obscure, and that is its unpredictability. Which leads me back to what I started with, whether AI will be conscious. And a fascinating question around this is the assumption that if we create actual causally thinking artificial intelligence, it'll be conscious. But as writers, AI specialists like Susan Schneider have pointed out, we shouldn't necessarily make that connection. Because we're biological beings and we're surrounded by biological beings, we tend to assume that intelligence implies consciousness. And we can see it in animals. We assume animals are self-aware, they have a subjective sense of self. But what if there's no connection and we create artificial intelligence that really isn't conscious, but is super intelligent, or its consciousness is so far removed from ours, we can never actually hope to understand it, which makes the unpredictability factor even more disquieting. So that's all the kind of potentially disturbing aspects of artificial intelligence that I'm interested in. On the more positive side, I'm really kind of excited about how artificial intelligence and robots could very rapidly expand space exploration that's off Earth. On Earth, I think artificial intelligence can also help the desperately needed work to renew the climate and to help put a stop to the climate change, which is leading to so many dangerous events occurring. And then, of course, at a more personal level, health and wellness, how machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, and the products of it could help people suffering all sorts of disabilities, neuro disabilities and physical disabilities. So that's basically kind of my focus of interest on these questions.
That's great. Father Larae, John, thanks so much. We're going to circle back to those great issues, but Father Larae, please jump in.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, John, for those comments. It's also a pleasure for me to be here, which is in Rome, so I'm not actually sure where here is anymore with Zoom conversations, because this is a very important issue, and I think it's admirable that the Hank Center is hosting this panel so that we can deepen the discussion around this issue. I'm coming at this primarily from a philosophical point of view, even though I'm a Catholic priest, and therefore the theological or spiritual aspects are all also very important. But I teach philosophy, and so what I've been attempting to do for the past maybe 4 or 5 years is to bring the richness of the Catholic tradition to bear on issues that are being discussed today around new technologies and artificial intelligence. I'm convinced that an Aristotelian Thomistic framework is very convenient and very apt in order to discuss artificial intelligence and other new technologies also. In what sense? Let me just outline a couple of arguments that I think can be addressed through a philosophical framework that we received from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. The first one is precisely where John left off his conversation in terms of consciousness. Many neuroscientists are still unsure about what consciousness is. David Chalmers says it's the big argument, it's the tough question in neuroscience. We always talk about consciousness. We know we feel conscious, especially when we're not asleep. That's usually what distinguishes conscious state from unconscious state, or being in a coma. But we're not really sure from a scientific point of view what it is. So it's not really clear what would constitute evidence of a machine being conscious. This is something that is not easy to address, and I think from a philosophical point of view, it is easier to address primarily through the relationship between the mind and the body from an Aristotelian Thomistic point of view. Another issue is that regarding brain implants and memory. This is now becoming very important because MIT has a lab, artificial intelligence lab, that they're doing a lot of work on memory. And for example, can we enhance memory through a brain implant? Thomas Aquinas would say, yes. He's not alive, and they didn't have brain implants in the 13th century. But Thomas Aquinas states that memory is an internal sense, and therefore it depends on the material substratum of the brain. So let's talk about radical memory extension. Can it be possible? Elon Musk is trying to do exactly this. Can we implant a chip in the brain that would allow our memories to be amplified or even suppressed? The government, the US military is working on this to suppress memories of soldiers coming back from the front. I think the answer is yes. It's not easy to do. The technology is very invasive right now, but there is a lot of work being done not only in MIT, but also at Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley. Radical life extension. Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil speak a lot about radical life extension. Live Long Enough to Live Forever is Ray's subtitle to his book. Some even are speaking about immortality. Is there a way to achieve immortality through digital enhancements? People are really beginning to speak about these issues, which of course the Catholic Church has always spoken about. The union between the mind and the body, the separation of the soul at the moment of death, the afterlife. It's fascinating to hear engineers from Google now talking about these kinds of issues also. Again, only through a adequate philosophical framework can these issues be addressed. And it's fascinating to hear, to see how software engineers and specialists in AI like Demis Hassabis in London are actually seeking out people in the Vatican in order to talk about these issues. Pope Francis himself, as Michael has quoted, has mentioned these issues. The Pontifical Council for Culture is very close also to these kinds of issues. Archbishop Paglia from the Pontifical Council, the Pontifical Academy for Life, is also brought together tech specialists and also entrepreneurs in order to speak about these issues. We talk about uploading consciousness. There's a lot of movies out there, which I love. I'm a huge sci-fi fan. One of the best on this issue is The 13th Floor, even though it's not very well known, but it talks about uploading a consciousness into a simulated reality, which is Los Angeles in the 1930s, I believe. But Transcendence with Johnny Depp, even you could talk about The Matrix. There's a lot of movies out there that talk about uploading our consciousness to a digital format. The ethics involved in AI. Again, you need a philosophical, and I think that Anne will speak to this, you need a philosophical framework to understand what is ethically appropriate when we talk about these technologies. And again, Aristotle outlined his ethical framework at the Nicomachean Ethics. And finally, transhumanism. Transhumanism is becoming very popular, not only in Silicon Valley, but Yuval Harari speaks about transhumanism often in his books. He's very influential. He's an historian that teaches in Israel. But there are many people that are beginning to ask, what is humanity going to look like when we are able to unite with machines? Put it that in a simple way. And Michael knows very well, and John also, we could talk for hours and hours on these issues, but let me leave my comments there so we can also hear Anne and then hear some of your questions.
Thanks very much, Father Larae. This is going to be an interesting discussion, I think, because I can already find some points of contention with some of your perspective. And I'm used to being the one that's the more hopeful, optimistic in conversations, but maybe I'm going to turn out to be the pessimist or the naysayer in this one. I come to this conversation as a 31-year resident of Silicon Valley, where I've held a couple of different leadership positions, as a scholar of leadership ethics, and as a mother. And so I want to speak from those three points of view in terms of how this is coming to me right now. One of the things I say about having held leadership positions is that it's often the hardest thing for leaders to do is nothing, is to just sort of sit on their hands and let things evolve. But in reality, I think it's harder to stop people from doing things that meet a few conditions when they sense that they have a personal right to do something, and that there's a perceived low risk to others, low harm. And we talk about that as sort of autonomy, right? We each get to decide what we want to do and make those decisions for ourselves. And there are several Catholic teachings that encourage that subsidiarity, sort of getting decisions down to the lowest level in organizations and groups to be made by people whenever possible. But here in Silicon Valley, there's an additional condition that makes it hard to stop people from doing something, which is if they can create something that's so cool, so bleeding edge, something that nobody's ever done before, and can be monetized, so much the better. So there's really this emphasis here in the Valley on new things, and that constant push for newness and fresh innovation is wonderful. And it's part of what made Silicon Valley sort of today's, Florence, Italy, in a Renaissance way. But it also comes a bit with some hubris, and hubris that might get packaged as humility. It might be described as, I'm here to try and do good. But really, fundamentally, there's an arrogance in there that we can make things better than they were made originally. And that's something for us to be aware of, I think. And what it results in here in Silicon Valley, anyway, is this sort of constant pressure towards instability that is frankly just not sustainable. So, we're sort of never done. We never settle on something. We're always moving to the next thing. When I think about this as a scholarship of leadership ethics, as a scholar of leadership ethics, I think about three things: how we define moral leadership, how we create value, and how the relationships we have with each other are affected and prioritized. And so, we define moral leadership on the basis of character and actions grounded in principles that we all navigate all day long in a series of trade-offs as we decide things. And we want to consider, I think now, as we use machine learning and create AI, how are we going to judge its character? How will we decide whether or not to follow it? And how will it decide to follow us? And perhaps most importantly, will we recognize when we have ceded to it as human beings? And I find myself on some days thinking that we've already done so. We have conversations like this, and we talk about the technological developments, and they continue, they march on, almost as if we don't have the free will now to stop it, to take kind of a global pause and have a humanity-wide conversation about what kind of world we want to live in and how much we value human beings over the ability to make the next cool thing. We believe, or I believe, that co-creation of value is helpful. We know when we talk about things like negotiations that win-win outcomes are the things that we try and encourage, where everybody gains something. In Jesuit universities, we use something called an integrated justice model when we're working with marginalized populations to encourage the co-creation of value with those populations, to work in collaboration with them, because we believe it leads to more humane, just, and sustainable outcomes. So now we have to add in the thinking about how does AI co-create with humans, and how we co-create with it. And the ethical lens that I bring to this is probably evident by now, is one of care ethics, originally put forth by Carol Gilligan, which asks us to think about how we care for ourselves, how we care for other people, and how we balance the two. And it's when we're finally balancing those two that we've kind of reached the highest level of conscience and moral judgment. And it's part of the reason I've been interested in considering the well-being of people in workplaces where AI is being introduced, because we need to be thinking about that trade-off. And then just finally, I'll say, as the mother of two children, including a 15-year-old boy, and as an educator, I worry about the subtle issues as much as the overt ones. Yes, Alexa might, mistakenly transmit a confidential conversation, and we think that's problematic. But I think we should be going a layer deeper. A friend of mine brought her high school age son an Alexa a few years ago. And I asked her if she had any qualms about the fact that he sat on his bed and asked an AI with a female name to do things for him all day. What if Siri or Alexa was named Bernard? Facebook may send a lot of confusing signals about whether it wants to connect us or make money off of us, but what signals are we sending when we choose to use it? What are we teaching our children? How to live a meaningful, purposeful life, or package the life that we live so it looks good on Facebook or Instagram? What expectations are we creating about the level of interest we expect people to have in the somewhat mundane details of our lives? Who cares if I got a triple cream latte at Starbucks this morning, or even if I just saw a beautiful sunset? It suggests that I can only enjoy the sunset if people know that I just saw a beautiful sunset. And it takes us out of the now and the ability to live in the present moment. I think we're reinforcing a disturbing level of self-absorption, and we're not really considering the damage to the environment that we're creating. We talk a lot about AI and data issues. We aren't, but maybe not enough about just their carbon footprint. A friend of mine in the early 2000s was the chief data center executive at Apple Computer. And he was an early zealot about creating data collection and storage that had a minimal impact on the environment. He built Apple's billion-dollar data center in North Carolina. He built one for eBay in Utah. And what Olivier would say is no data center is more efficient than the one you don't have to build. And so there we are, back to doing nothing. So that's what's hitting me now, is who is thinking about doing nothing or pausing? I mean, I know there are dedicated professionals around the globe thinking about AI and all the problems it can solve and create, and a few of them are right here. But until we have some agreements and boundaries, I think we should be standing down on development of technology until we understand better and can think through how to manage the market. As my husband is constantly reminding me, we have more than we can manage. And I think we need to be thinking about that. So that's, those are the ways that I'm thinking about it. I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Thank you, John and Father Larae. I have a list of follow-ups here. I've been taking notes, but I just want to ask Father Larae and John just to stick with Anne a bit and respond to what Anne has kind of given to us. Anything moving in you? We'll start with you, Father Larae.
Those are very profound insights, Anne. Let me just address one quickly, because we half an hour is not enough time. These are huge concerns that we need to be thinking about. My impression is that there's no going back, and that this is, we can't stop it. Now, is that something good? Probably not. But once you add the market incentive to these technologies, which you mentioned, and they're just so strong, that there's really no way of putting the genie back into the bottle. So humanity has survived up until now because we've been lucky. I think we tend not to look at the consequences of our actions. We have created instruments that can be the end of humanity. And Stephen Hawking said that AI could end up being the highest risk, existential risk of all time. But I think that we need to sort this out while we're navigating on the high seas. It's here to stay, and it's only going to get more and more prevalent in our lives. So I'm optimistic. You mentioned I think it's fascinating what you said about Alexa and your son. I think that human nature tends to right itself. My students, they're not on Facebook anymore because they say, oh, my mom's on Facebook, so I'm not on Facebook. They're on TikTok and Instagram. Okay, but the point is, I think we all get obsessed with the technology, and then we work through it and we start using it to enhance our lives, not to run our lives.
Yeah, thanks, Father. That's great. John, what's brewing in you? I mean, maybe something connects to your recent article and with what Anne is kind of lifting up for us.
Well, actually, I think she's right, and just from a personal point of view, there were 2 or 3 times over the past few years where I thought about, I need to get off Facebook. I shouldn't do this anymore. But kind of to Father Larae's point, I realized that if I did that, there were a lot of people I knew on there. And I'm basically on Facebook in groups because I found that groups of people, fellow writers and so forth, and fellow Catholics, that we could kind of support each other there in a way that I'd never done before. And I realized we floated this discussion, and everybody kind of came to the same conclusion. which was that if we do that, we're going to lose touch with each other. We're not going to go back to sending each other emails or, sharing blog posts. So I kind of agree with Father Larae, although I'm not happy about it, that we're going to have to, kind of natural select our way through this period and hope that even as we're kind of weathering the destructive stuff, ingenious people will also think of ways where we can use it to heal and maybe even make things better than they were before. Not everywhere, obviously, but perhaps in some social arrangements or places where people are overlooked or marginalized. I don't know.
think you're right. I think you're right. And I'm going to come back to you, Anne. But, it's interesting because we would think there's always there's something neutral about technology, right? It's whatever the human brings to it. Yet Pope Francis points out somewhere in the early 100s of Laudato Si that digital technology is not neutral, that there's something embedded in it. And if you pull on that thread, you might find Jaron Lanier, who you wrote about, John, and his admonition to quit social media now, the 10 reasons why. Or you think about that movie, The Social Dilemma, about that as Anne points out, that there's something that the social networks and getting involved in the technocratic loop or the technological loop it feeds kind of a self-importance narcissism maybe, and that's because it hits the brain. The brain wants its dopamine. Things can't keep up with those hits you get. So I'm just kind of swirling around that. And to go back to you have so many wonderful points about ethical implications of this technology. I think even of where you are. I was born in San Mateo, as I mentioned, and grew up in California. And my dad worked in Silicon Valley. It was called Santa Clara Valley when he started there. And even before that, it was Ohlone lands, I believe. So now it's Silicon Valley and all of that. And then what is this Silicon Valley? Well, you're saying it's an unstable kind of group that kind of breeds almost precarity, even with all of its genius. So I'm just, there's a lot here. And what do you think after listening to Father Larae and John and me as you work through?
Well, I like, thanks for bringing the richness of Silicon Valley's history forward. There's one moniker that you didn't toss in there that I think is also useful, which is the Valley of Heart's Delight. And that's what it was referred to when it was known largely for its orchards and for its agricultural bounty, right? And for the beautiful place that nature had created here. And I first of all, I love hearing from John and Father Larae, because it reminds me, we have these discussions at the Markle Center on Monday mornings where we talk through emerging issues in the news. And Mike, as you know, I have a colleague, Brian Green, who has studied many things. He's got a giant brain, including transhumanism. And I remember the first time we talked about it when I first came to the center, and I was, shocked. It was news to me that people were really considering immortality, for example, as something that is viable and good. And I joked with Brian that I was going to get a shirt that said, I'm a deathist on it, because it was, to me, we're starting to tinker a whole lot without fully understanding the implications. And that's one of the fundamental questions in ethical deliberation, right? Which is trying to anticipate those downstream effects and say, or also as Brian and some of my other colleagues say, think about the terrible people. So I love and buoyed by all the wonderful examples that people have of the goodness that AI and advances in technology can bring to us. I've benefited from many of them. So have my family members, from medical and all kinds of innovation. And so I am so grateful for that. And I'm so still aware and feeling the need, particularly to speak for the children. And I feel like the children don't have a very good ambassador representing them in the world right now. And speaking both to the issues of intergenerational justice, climate is one of those, racism, some of those things, and certainly how we handle our technology, but just in the now, right now, what's good for children. And we know, we can see and document the harms that social media, for example, is bringing to children, even as we use social media in classrooms to good effect, and it's wonderful. We can't really put the boundaries around it that we need to protect the students outside of classrooms. And we know some really, really terrible experiences are being woven into what childhood is now, well before, frankly, the brain that we're all talking about is formed and can really handle it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That data and those studies are staggering of the deleterious effects of that early encounter with digital culture. Really, they are. We have like the tail wagging the dog, and having the technology out there, then trying to catch up with it, as you're suggesting. You know, we need, Father Larae referred to this, we need days of reflection on this topic. We need Brian Greene. Brian Greene was instrumental in getting this together, and Brian Greene has a huge brain. You're right. But let's carry on with our structure here, and then come back with some viewer questions. So I'm going to go to the next thing and say, okay, Father Larae, we'll start with you this time. Okay, what are some Catholic responses to an increasingly artificial world?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Catholic, I would assume that you're asking me to come from the environment of the Catholic Church, and so I guess that would, for me, that means principally the Bible, the written word, the magisterium of the Church, so the history of the doctrine of the Church. Anne mentioned also the social doctrine of the Church, subsidiarity, solidarity, distribution of wealth, the dignity of the human person in the workplace, a minimum salary, and it goes. I mean, it's very well structured. It just we don't talk a lot about those things. Maybe we should. And then, of course, the richness of the tradition. So that I was trained by the Jesuits. Michael, it's great to hear. My father got his PhD at Santa Clara University, probably before you were born. And I was born in Mountain View before Google arrived. It was a very low income section of the valley, and the government had just closed the Air Force base a couple of years before we moved out there. And I asked my mom, you know, what would the house be worth today? She said about $3 million, and I think they sold it for $12,000 at the time. So the richness of the tradition of the Church, I think, can help frame a lot of these issues, and that's what I try to do in my book on artificial humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Father Larae. That's what I was kind of after. You really outlined, you know, the Catholic, you get all the levels and dimensions of it. I always think of the Catholic intellectual tradition. You know, let me just give you one more tug here, because on Aristotle and friendship, because you think about AI, you know, I think I mentioned I just got this book in the mail by Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun, and the protagonist is an artificial friend, and her name is Clara. Now I think of, okay, what would Aristotle say about friendship and artificial intelligence? So maybe a quick thought on that before we throw it over to John.
Sorry, Michael, do you want me to touch on that or go to John on that?
Yeah, no, yes, Father Larae, I want you to, as an Aristotelian, think about maybe, you know, yeah, just the possibilities for friendship, maybe soul. There's questions about baptizing AI creations. There's co-creation. Yeah. All these things are bundled up. Anne's talking about co-creation. So what? Yeah, go ahead, please.
You know, Aristotle lived 2,500 years ago. I'm not sure what he would say, but I think that a digital friendship would not fly for Aristotle. He mentioned specifically that friendships have to be real and interpersonal. They have to be between people in a physical realm. You know, you can have a friendship with someone by mail, for example, but it's not the same. He makes it very clear. He also says that when he talks about virtue, because friendship is the end of virtue, right? That virtue is the basis of the good life for Aristotle. He says one thing is to read about riding a horse, and the other thing is to be an expert horse rider. And in order to do that, you need a lot of time sitting on the back of a horse. And even actually Aristotle makes that example, but he talks about other, a carpenter, an expert carpenter is not someone who's read a lot of books on the carpentry, but who has experience making it. So I think he would say friendship has to be in the physical reality. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Okay, John, what do you think? Catholic responses, again, very vague, but maybe, how do you think about that?
Well, I can't resist, since you brought up the Katsuo book, and Father Larae mentioned being a science fiction geek. Speaking of friendship, there was a great novel, I think it was 1977, by Algis Budrys called Michaelmas. And he's sort of a huge media mogul, and he has an AI, basically an AI. I wouldn't call it a servant. It's almost a friend. His name is Domino. And the two of them together kind of solve the problems of the world at the time. And it's been a long time since I read the book, but it would almost make you challenge that idea. Although I do agree with Father Larae that in the Aristotelian sense, you can't really be friends with a machine unless, and this brings up again, the Aristotelian approach, which I really like. And this speaks to something that Susan Schneider is actually working on at her lab, Florida Atlantic University. Because I asked her, what if instead of one-offs, we started to build robots from used parts, pretty much the way we, as a product of evolution, we're built from used parts that have descended from other species. What kind of effect would that have on such a robot's sense of itself? And thinking about it in terms of, since the soul is the form of the body in Aristotle's terminology, would that kind of a robot have a different sense of soul than just, a box that was purely designed from the ground up to be this thing, which is a fact.
That's almost like Frankenstein in a way. I mean, it really is, but please carry on, John.
No, that was basically the point I was going to make. The Catholic perspective is that I like the idea only in the sense that I think AI is going to make us reconsider, or perhaps reappreciate is the better word, the whole Aristotelian view of the human composite and the soul as the form of the body, not just as this invisible entity that's fused onto us, which is more like, the Neoplatonic view.
Yeah, it's outstanding. Thank you for drilling down, as they say, on those on the constituent parts of Aristotelian and Old Greek philosophy. It's really helpful. So, Anne, what do you think then? You've listed some things in your first go around, but Catholic responses to an increasingly artificial world.
Well, I guess one of the things that's been with me in my life as a Catholic always is that we do things in community. That we are together with each other in our experiences, and that in fact that's how we interpret our experiences. And we know that from human psychology and the study, again, back to how parents bond with their children and see each other. And so that, and the Pope Francis has just been writing about this with such clarity in Fratelli Tutti, which I've just finally finished reading. And it reminds us and encourages us to stay in that community and to stay in these moments of dialogue and exchange or encounter, as he refers to them. And so that's sort of the frame that I bring to the work that I do around this. And it's drawn me, therefore, to the work of scholars around psychology and the brain. There's one out of UCLA, Dr. Dan Siegel, who's just this prolific author. He's probably written 15 books, and I've only read 3 or 4 of them. But he really looks at how our minds are created. And he says, it's both the way the brain is integrated, the right and left sides of it come together. It's also the way that we have relationships with other people. And those two things together help us to create this mind, this sort of ability to get out over ourselves and reflect and learn and think about what has happened to us. And so we take that into organizations and we try and help them think about those same issues to create healthy cultures. And again, I just come back to, Jesuits love the senses, and so they would love Dan Siegel because he talks about, in addition to the five senses that most of us learn in elementary school, this sixth sense, our ability to understand our internal state, the seventh sense, which is this mind sight, this ability to get out over ourselves and look back and think. And the eighth sense is this human interconnectedness. So it's really that last one that I think is where we need to spend the time in these conversations to think about how we want to be connected to one another and how the introduction of AI might influence that. And that's why some of the work I've done so far has been around trying to just help organizations, even in a punch list kind of way. Just here are some questions that you should go through and ask yourself as you start to bring AI into the workforce, to think about the well-being of the people that, as I say, that are connecting to it or attempting to connect to it or attempting to co-create value with it. And so I think that's we're not maybe spending enough time on the impact on humanity and the way we interact with each other.
Wonderful. And, I think we really have a synthesis emerging here. Father Larae is referring to Aristotle and friendship being the end of virtue is friendship. You are speaking about the care is the top of the pyramid. The eighth sense, interconnectedness, relationship is the culmination of human life. I would say even beyond human, creative life. So that's wonderful. Let's now shift though to our guests and our viewers, and we'll start with Frank Butler. And he has a question. What about AI impact on jobs? Weapons automation, algorithmic biases, privacy violations, socioeconomic inequality? There's a bundle there. Who wants to take it first? Maybe I can nominate. Okay, I saw you unmuting, Father Larae. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I unmuted to say I don't want to go first. It's just too much. Those are very complex issues that Ann and I have a mutual friend, Tae Yu from Cisco, and she's actually in charge of the World Economic Forum's task force on the future of jobs. So, there are a lot of smart people out there that are thinking about these things. Again, I think in the short term, AI is creating jobs, but in the long term, it's going to take jobs. But that's kind of human evolution. Many Americans used to work the land; they don't anymore. 2% of Americans are involved in agriculture. 100 years ago, it was 82%. So I'm optimistic. I think that people will find other jobs if their job is replaced by an AI. But again, I don't think this is imminent. I mean, within the next 10 years, I don't think we're going to have a massive unemployment. It's one of the things I disagree with Tristan Harris and the social dilemma. I think it's going to be more gradual.
Thank you, Father. Ann.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with Father that it'll be more gradual. But again, we have some choices that we can be making about how those transitions happen. And we can look to technological changes that have come into other industries and how we've kind of preserved the dignity of people, whether it's with guarantee of work, even if the work changes, that will retrain you or will out-train you, if you will, as you leave our organization. I was really struck, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago, I participated in a Fortune CEO conference by how many of the CEOs were speaking, and these were in closed conversations. So, you could imagine maybe some ethics washing or some virtue signaling going on, trying to position, their companies as being very thoughtful and all of that and caring about people. But in reality, the only audience they had was each other. And the conversation sounded very genuine to me about their rethinking their obligation about when their relationship with employees ends. And as whole job categories are no longer needed, I think there's a recognition in corporate leadership that they have some both obligation and then, call it enlightened self-interest that it will, accrue back to them to thoughtfully and responsibly train people with new skills for whatever is next, still as part of their initial employment relationship, even with the company that they might be leaving. And I found that to be very progressive and leadership, and the kind of thinking that we need to be bringing to the conversations that we're having with organizations like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and all the major faiths in the world.
Thank you, Anne. An observation from you, John?
Yes, I find that actually very uplifting, because I think I mentioned before that article last week by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times, and he's talking about the next bloodbath, basically, which AI is going to cause. Up until now, it's been the displacement of people without college degrees who are used to manufacturing jobs. And he thinks that the next really bad wave is going to be people who do have college degrees but are in middle management, and that AI and technology is going to displace them. So that, to Anne's point, it's very necessary that we have that. Well, one, that I'm glad that the business leaders are noticing this, that we really need to think about investing in human beings and not just, what's the technology that's going to, make more profit and, cut back our taxes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, this kind of speaks to an observation from one of our viewers, Nancy Gonzalez, and she observes, AI is great for making contributions to our society. However, we, the body of Christ, we believe in the imago Dei. Thus, no machine or software can replace us, can replace our humanity. So there's, I think a lot of people, even if you're not even a believer or a theist, if you're a humanist, you might have similar reservations and then get to work. Let me get to some more questions here, everybody. This is one, maybe Anne might have began with this with Alexa, but this is from Michelle Gorman. What about the racism that's embedded in technology? The mindsets of humans get embedded in the tech. Anybody have a thought on that?
Well, Mike, this may be one other way that AI is helping us, because it's not that the racism is embedded in the AI, right? It's embedded in the human beings, and the human beings are creating the AI. So in a way, it's allowing us to hold up a mirror through glass darkly, right? We can see ourselves now a little bit more clearly and see our flaws and our built-in biases. And even though we write and talk about them as being unconscious biases, and we acknowledge that, and we're all only human, it doesn't mean, therefore, that we don't have any responsibility to try and change it. And so I feel like this is where, as we are becoming troubled by baking in these biases, things like systemic racism and sexism, into the things that we're creating, we have to be first dealing with and encountering it in ourselves. And so I think the creation of AI has in some way helped us to get new language, so anti-racist language, and even the identification of behaviors that will help to create conditions of anti-racism. I think that has been a gift, really, of the dawn of some of this technology, and that's been requiring us to think about it. And so I'm grateful for that.
If I can, Mike, add my 2 cents on that. I think the algorithms are getting better and better as you give it more data. And engineers are realizing that the programs are exhibiting our prejudices. And I think that they're trying to take steps in order to correct that. It's not easy. But for example, let me give a quick example. A judge in the United States today, when he or she sentences someone at a court being found guilty, the judge has to state whether or not he or she is using a software to help identified the sentence. And of course, software, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, who is the guilty person? What is their race? What is their income? What is their geographical setting, et cetera? And then what are the chances of that person committing another crime? And then how many people are in jail? I mean, the software does all of that, okay? But it is fascinating that the law requires a judge to say whether or not they're using that software. So that, to Ann's point, that means that just because it's a AI doesn't mean it doesn't have prejudices. And I think that some sentences are being overturned in courts today because of the prejudice of the AI. So again, I'm hopeful that the algorithms get better and better as you give it more data and eliminate the prejudices.
Yeah, wow. Again, we're coming to our time here. We know we haven't even got into algorithms yet, and algorithms touch our lives in so many ways that a lot of folks aren't even aware of. But thank you, Father Larrey, for that texture. John, do you have a final thought before we move to close?
Only a scary one about algorithms, which is the interconnectedness of some things. Like, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling. You get ads on Facebook about something that you might have seen on something that has nothing to do with Facebook, maybe just a web browser. And somehow these things are all talking to each other without you even knowing it. It's just another example of how, like, your privacy and what you might be thinking about or even choosing is being exposed to people who just want to make money. That's kind of a down note to end on, but since we're talking about algorithms, and hopefully those do get better, or at least give us some means of shutting them off.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm struck here because I don't want to leave on a dark note. I'll say this: this conversation is in full bloom. We're going to return to this in the Hank Center and keep going. But I want to make sure I get a couple more of our viewers before we close. Robert Cambick writes this: I've been in IT for 55 years. In my opinion, we are too sanguine here. I think God is sending us a message, biblically maybe. Roman Catholicism must interpenetrate every decision that we make regarding how we are to live in the present and in the future. There's a group he cites called INCOS, which is a group of, I think, technologists, IT workers, computer scientists that are really coming from their own group and thinking ethically. So I want to thank you, Robert, for that. And this last one from Stephen Pluhacek, I believe, and pardon me, Stephen, if I have that wrong. I think your observation helps us close. Not a question, just an observation. The general failure to think about anthropology, just what does it mean to be human, and what is required for our full flourishing and accomplishment, prevents us from having a truly substantive conversation about AI and technology in general. I think you're right, Stephen. Final thoughts quickly, lightning round from the panel. And Skeet.
We're doing what needs to be done. I mean, this is the exchange and the dialogue, and we need to keep doing more of this. And I think all kinds of organizations have an obligation to engage in this, not just higher ed institutions, not just Catholic ones.
Thanks, Ann. John Farrell.
I agree with that comment from the gentleman, especially because I think anthropology is something that needs to be more deeply explored, even as we learn more about ourselves through modern science, including evolution.
Thank you, John. And finally, Father Phillip Larrey.
Conversations like this one demonstrate that these pressing issues are trying to be dealt with. Anne mentioned the United Nations. I know the European Commission is publishing guidelines in terms of the ethical use of AI. I know that the platforms are out there. Jan LeCun from Facebook, Demis Hassabis from Google, and the list. And you know these people because they live next door. These are very profound issues that need a lot of reflection. And I think that the Catholic Church, especially along the example of Pope Francis, is trying to address these issues. But thank you so much, Michael, for organizing this.
Thank you, Father Larae. Thank you, Ann Skeet, and thank you, John Farrell. Thanks also to Megan Toomey and Kathleen McNutt. And thank you, viewers, for taking time out of your day. Blessings to all, and thanks again.
Thank
Have a
you so
good
much.
day.
Take care.